Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We'll give folks just a moment to join us. I'd like to wish you all a very happy Construction Safety Week. I'm sure you all already know it is Construction Safety Week. Lots of great resources out there online. We have some specifically on the CII website. Our safety community for business advancement wrote a blog that is posted live on our blog section of our website at construction-institute.org. And we all know that CII is about improving people. So our members can attest that engaging with CII is one of the best ways to develop your professionals, and you'll see that in action at the CII annual conference. On this next slide, you have a QR code that will give you an opportunity to register for that CII conference. It will be in Nashville, July 28th through 30th. You'll learn from the research teams, discover new tech at the Innovation Showcase, and of course, experience the best networking in industry. On the next slide, we tell you a little bit about CII's boot camp. So that is actually happening right now. Don't worry about that QR code, because that will take you to the session that's happening right now on campus at UT. But it is a new program. It's a crash course on industry best practice, and you can reach out to our team for more information about signing up for the next offering of the boot camp. And we wanted to also just let you know that the Q&A session will be held until the very end of this live webinar. So if you can use the gray control panel to enter your questions, we'll address those at the very end. And I'd like to also introduce our presenters today. So we have Noé Saenz with Burns & McDonnell. He has 26 years of experience leading capital projects and PMOs in the energy and industrial segments across North America. He's been involved with CII for more than 17 years in multiple roles and initiatives, and has always been a big promoter and implementer of the CII best practice. He's going to tell you more about that coming up. Noé currently serves as the chair of CII's executive committee. I'm sure you've seen him around the CII functions. We also have Mike Pappas with Los Alamos National Labs. Mike has 36 years of experience managing and consulting on infrastructure and energy projects on 5 continents. He's currently the program director for project management at Los Alamos National Labs, leading 90 project managers who are delivering more than $8 billion in capital projects. He has been involved with CII for 27 years and is also currently on the executive committee. So we're very grateful to have both of these experts in CII here to share more with you about best practices that can save your projects. I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Our safety moment this morning is improving hazard recognition. We know that recognizing hazards is the foundation to working safely. When we bring workers to the job site, they bring a lot of emotions with them. Some of them may have financial stress because they've been off work for a while. They may have concerns about family members' jobs or health or schooling or childcare not being available. We all know distraction is deadly on a construction site. We have to make sure our people have their heads in the game, that they're focused on the tasks and the hazards around them.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. You're having audio issues. Noé, are you hearing that as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you using a headset? I apologize, everyone.
Yeah, I am. Just a second.
Okay. It just sounded a little gurgled.
A little bit, yeah.
You've probably seen this energy wheel in various industry posts on LinkedIn and other places. I've seen it translated into other languages, and I've seen people make hard hat stickers and challenge coins out of it. It was originally developed by CII Research Team 293, and this is just one example of how CII research has wide impact on the construction industry. The next slide shows a summary of that research. The 3 strategies they came up with improved hazard recognition by at least 28% in the people who participated. We have 3 acronyms here. SAVES is the System for Augmented Virtual Safety, a realistic augmented reality training environment that immerses workers in a job site simulation. SMQM is the Pre-Job Safety Meeting Quality Measurement, a maturity model that facilitates continuous improvement of the pre-job hazard identification and communication process. Most companies require a pre-job safety meeting, but the quality and effectiveness of those meetings varies widely. HIT is a hazard identification and transmission board that records hazard at the work site to visually remind people what they're dealing with. The next slide shows an example HIT board. This is a visual reminder at the work site of the task hazards and new hazards that the crew is dealing with. Okay, let's review today's agenda. We want to talk about what assessments do for capital projects and portfolios, and then we'll discuss 5 specific assessments, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. The 5 assessments we'll share are shown on the next slide. So we've got the CII Project Definition Rating Index, or PDRI, the CII Integrated Project Risk Assessment, or IPRA, the CII Project Health Indicator, the CII Construction Readiness Assessment, and the Portfolio Program Readiness Assessment that was developed by Burns and McDonnell. Noé, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Let's start with the bottom line, sharing what assessments do for capital projects, and that is they help prevent million-dollar surprises. And we're not trying to exaggerate here. It is a reality because they help us align stakeholders with a methodical approach, as well as identify risks proactively at the different phases of a project, as well as facilitating stakeholder communication. As we always hear, the #1 reason for project failure is poor communication. So these assessments help you formalize the way you do your reviews or prepare for those reviews. And one of those ways to help is also assessing readiness between project phases. And what I mean by that is what I'm showing on my screen. This is the typical project. There's different definitions of the different phases. In this case, I'm calling them from screening phase, the feasibility phase, conceptual design, detailed design, etc. What you want to have is a formal and methodical way to manage those transitions between phases. As most of you are familiar with the phase gate framework, and that's ideal to have between phases. You can see here the gates, but to prepare for those gates, what you want to do is use the right assessments prior to prepare for those gate reviews. I mean, realistically, Mike and I can tell you, Mike is an owner, I am a contractor as well as a consultant. Those review meetings, the gate reviews, can be very short. They are executive level meetings. Sometimes you have minutes to present information. So how do you assure that you have the right deliverables with the right maturity to be able to advance to the next phase and get approval for funding? That's where the assessments come in. Now, these are at the project level. What happens at the organizational level, maybe at the portfolio or program level? The one very critical thing to assess is how ready the owner is to embark in a new portfolio project or program. That is something we'll talk about as well. And now we have a poll, and Mike, would you please help us with that?
Yeah, sure will. Here I've got it launched. Please remember to put your display on full screen to interact with the poll. Okay, 5 seconds. So here are the results. 70% said during front-end development, 21% during detailed engineering, 1% during construction, 3% when problems arise, and 4% never. Okay, Noé, please tell us about the PDRI.
Well, I mean, frankly, thank you everybody for your responses. That gives us some context. I mean, there's an opportunity there to increase. Well, this is what we're doing. Why we're doing this webinar is to increase the awareness of the different types of assessments. So let's talk about the first one that is the most popular of all. This is a tool that CII developed many years ago. Let's talk about what it is. It is a tool that helps you to do multidisciplinary reviews during the front end, and it's a scope maturity assessment tool. And the reason why you want to do this is to evaluate the maturity of those key assessments, deliverables, including not only the project people, but also your business groups, your operations groups, etc., internal and external stakeholders. Maybe you have an engineering contractor, a construction firm, etc. That's when you want to involve them as early as possible. And again, the who needs to be involved is from all the departments in your company that are involved with the project. And you want to do this in sessions which typically take between 2 to 4 hours. It just depends on the size of the project. Sometimes it can take a little longer, and that's totally okay. And you want to do this ideally facilitated by a third party. And that third party can be somebody from within the company that is not associated with the project. That's ideal. Or a third party, an independent facilitator is also very much recommended. You want to do this, as I mentioned, during the front end phases of the project. And here is where, in my experience, the PDRI is the best way to prepare and align your stakeholders in preparation for your gate reviews at the end of each of the phases to get approval to move to the next phase. The tool is, as I mentioned, is one of the most popular of CII, and there are a number of versions of this tool. The original one was for industrial projects, as you can see there on the screen, and the next one was for building types of projects. And the next one that CI developed was the one for infrastructure projects. Then CI developed also versions for small industrial and for small infrastructure projects. And most recently, CI developed the one for manufacturing and life sciences, which is a combination, let's call it a hybrid between industrial and the building versions. The way this tool works is basically like a checklist in simple terms. You can see some of the different sections from the basis of project decision, including some of the business objectives, basic data that you need to be considering, as well as the basis of design. This is section number 2 of the PDRI. And then there's also the execution approach of the project, section number 3. And what you have is very detailed definitions of each of the elements. Right now, I'm pointing to the pre-commissioning turnover sequence requirements. And the tool describes what you should be expecting or requiring, frankly, in that area of the project. So now your team and your stakeholders know what is needed. So then they get to score where they are in that element or that deliverable. Now, this is not a score of the team. You're not auditing the team on how well they are performing. It's about how much information they have documented so far. So nobody should feel bad if they get a high score. Why I say a high score is because the scoring of the PDRI is like golf. The lower the score, the better. So if you haven't even started on these requirements, well, then that means it's a 5. And that's totally fine. You shouldn't feel bad if you see green, if you see red. You should be happy that you're identifying that as something to be developed, perhaps something that could be considered a risk if it's not defined properly. Based on CI research, projects that use PDRI and they get to scores that are low, truly low, because the team has been very diligent about scoring the right way. If you get a score below 200 before starting detailed design, history shows, based on CI research, that those projects experience 25% less cost growth and way better scheduled performance. That is huge. And people that are not aware, especially executives, they need to know about the PDRI and the benefits of investing in this process. And let's talk about the ROI of the investment in the PDRI process. Think about this. For every dollar you invest in PDRI, you can save up to $25 in return. So if you invest $40,000 in a very thorough PDRI in the sessions and involving the right people, you can easily save $1 million later on by avoiding surprises that nobody talked about because it was not thought of. And the PDRI can definitely help you with all the questions, predefined questions. So in my experience, frankly, it's the most beneficial side of the PDRI sessions are, yes, the scoring for sure, because you have a method, but it's the conversation. It's like, oh, we haven't thought about that. I'm glad you reminded us. Let's make a note. We'll follow up later before we get to the next phase. And you start documenting and putting your action plans and frankly, feeding your risk register as well by using the PDRI. That's been my experience, the most beneficial side of the PDRI. How about for you, Mike?
Yeah, thanks. I've used all three large project versions of the tool, industrial, infrastructure, and buildings, much of that as a consultant. But I just did a PDRI 3 using the infrastructure tool for a $350 million power transmission line project here at Los Alamos. So we had 17 people from the core project team in the workshop. It took us about 3 hours to complete it. And the project scored 335 out of 1,000, which is a little high for a PDRI 3. But like Noé said, more valuable than the overall score are the action items and the discussion around the maturity of the scope elements. So even though they have a 335 right now, they've got a list of action items to focus on to bring that score down where it needs to be. The second tool we'll discuss today is the Integrated Project Risk Assessment. This is a risk identification and assessment checklist that can improve the effectiveness of your risk management process. Using a checklist is generally a good idea to help you not miss something, but you don't want to use it as a crutch and assume that it covers everything. So be sure to think outside the checklist as well. Now, similar to the PDRI, you want to use this with a neutral facilitator and the project team. The next slide shows some of the details of the tool. The checklist includes 82 risk factors grouped into 14 categories. When they developed this tool, they considered different perspectives, those of the investors, asset owner, EPC contractors, and asset operators. So they followed the guidance or the principle of good risk processes by getting input from different perspectives. So that's something that you want to do as well. The PDRI, you can kind of do that with the core project team. This tool, you want to have wider participation to get different perspectives. The tool includes a formal method to identify and assess risk, and this is one of those tools you want to use repeatedly through the project lifecycle because the risk landscape constantly changes. The assessment sheet is shown on the next slide. In the far left column, you see 7 of the 82 risk elements that make up the business plan category. For each risk, you first estimate the likelihood of that risk occurring. In the IPRA, this is ranked from 1 to 5, from very low to very high. There is a not applicable category, but that is only if that risk truly does not exist on your project. Not if you don't think it will bite you, or you think you have it covered, or if you write it down, you'll get unwanted attention from the home office. You got to be honest about this stuff. The next step is to estimate the relative impact of the risk if it occurs. In the IPRA, this is ranked on an A through E scale from negligible to extreme. And again, you see the descriptions down at the bottom. One of the unique things about the IPRA is that it was originally developed for projects in new and complex jurisdictions. Sometimes you're in a new situation, and early in front-end planning, you don't even know completely what you're getting into or how to assess the impact of a risk. The unknown unknowns, if you will. The IPRA has this baseline column that you can use as a starting point for severity if you have nothing else to go on. Now, if you do this, stick with the baseline impact until you have enough information that you can make your own rating, but at least it's a good place to start. The next slide shows what I call the dirty dozen risks. These are the 12 extreme risks in the IPRA, and if you've ever had issues with any of these, you know how serious they are. These are the kind of things that can cripple a project. The next slide shows the process. The tool includes a detailed description for each of the 82 elements. So you read the description, you discuss that risk in the workshop, and then you discuss what the likelihood of occurrence and the relative impact for that risk are, just like we talked about. Then you plot the risk on the risk matrix. And at the end of the assessment, you can see how the risks are distributed in the risk matrix to get an overall view of your risk picture. If you click one more time, there you go. Yeah, put the numbers up there. That way you can see where the risks are spread in the risk matrix. Next, we'll talk about practical implementation. The IPRA was originally developed for projects in foreign jurisdictions. So at Los Alamos, all of our projects are on the lab property. So I went through the tool and customized it for our projects. About 30 of the elements are not applicable for our projects because they're here in New Mexico, but that still leaves about 50 that do apply. Noé, over to you.
Hey, Mike, about the IPRA, the one thing that I really like, the best thing about this tool is that it complements the PDRI, and because it covers, frankly, not only the internal scope elements of a project, but the external factors that, in my experience, are the ones that affect our projects even more because they're out of your control. And if you're not thinking about them, and that happens to us, project managers, program managers, we're typically thinking inside the program or project, not outside. So having somebody help you to facilitate these risk assessments throughout the project, as Mike mentioned, has been the most valuable in my experience, Mike. So thanks for sharing. Now let's talk about the project health indicator, which is one of my favorite ones because it's more on the people side of things, which if you, like me, have experience, that's typically where our challenges began, on the people side, not so much on the technical. So the PHI is an assessment that helps you to review or focus on 8 different areas. And we'll talk about those. This is mainly to be used during execution, during detailed design and construction. It complements the PDRI. If you remember, that's to be used during front-end design. This is to be used during execution. Again, with a neutral facilitator, and also someone who is not involved with the project, so they can ask the silly questions, as I mentioned. And it helps the team to really answer what they see as potential problems, and so they can identify risks early on, focus on those 8 practices, and also that are reflected in 5 key project outcomes that are cost, schedule, quality, safety, and stakeholder satisfaction. And here's an example of 7 of the 43 or so leading indicators that you're going to be providing answers to score the project team. I'll give you a few seconds to look at this. So you look at the statements, see statement 1, statement 2, then the team answers, or as a team with the facilitator answers where they feel the project is at that time. And based on their answers, they get a dashboard. This is the first of the 2 output dashboards that show you the likelihood of achieving successful outcomes in those areas. As I mentioned, cost, schedule, quality, safety, stakeholder satisfaction. Now you're seeing based on what the team is telling you instead of just one person or one people's perception. This is what the team is telling you based on what is happening right now. The next dashboard is about the 8 different project management practices. And at least in this example, you can see there's opportunity in the area of alignment and team building. Those are 2 are pretty much correlated, as you know, but also in the area of project control. In other areas, they're doing quite well, which you also want to highlight. You don't want to just focus on the negative, if you will, or on the weak spots, but also on the strong spots. And you want to also give them kudos, but you want to be proactive. And if the team is telling you, hey, we are having issues here, this is a formal way of, frankly, communicating to you as a project manager or as a project sponsor what is happening before it's too late. All right, so think about that. In my experience, Mike, once again, the score is important, looking at those gauges, but the conversation and the team knowing that there's a formal time where you listen to them that has been to me the most valuable thing, and frankly, it helps with morale as well. What about your experience, Mike?
Yeah, I've used this tool, but only during projects in execution that were in trouble. And that has helped to surface, it has helped to surface some of the core issues that need to be addressed in those projects. I have not been able to convince project teams to use this proactively, even though that would be the smartest use of the assessment.
And Mike, if I can ask, I mean, you're an owner, I'm a contractor, and as you and I know, when an owner is not aligned, they're having issues, but they don't want to admit it. Well, we all feel the effects. It's like the domino effect. So it's very important for the owner to be self-aware as an organization, if you will. In your experience, though, what prevents owners, very smart people, from doing these assessments that are been so beneficial? What's getting in the way?
Well, I think there's two things in general. One is, almost all projects are under schedule and cost pressure. And so a lot of times project managers will be really reluctant to do anything that's not required in the process, that they're not forced to do. Even though these assessments that we're talking about today are relatively low impact. I mean, you're talking about, the project team or the core project team and 1 to 4 hours to do these assessments. That's really low cost for the value of the information that you get out of it. And the second reason I think is that people even though our experience tells us differently, we love to go into a project thinking we're not going to have any people problems, we're not going to have any team problems, this project's going to go smoothly. And the fact is most of them don't. Well, a lot of them don't. And so this is a tool in particular that I think it would be easy to set up where you use it every quarter or every 6 months just to see how you're doing and to see if you can see any smoke anywhere, that there's a fire someplace that you need to work on.
Good point.
Okay. Next is the construction readiness assessment tool. So this tool is designed to assess a project's readiness to start construction in order to prevent incomplete or out of sequence work. The next slide shows a summary. Many CII research teams build on the results of previous teams, and this is one of those. And the next slide shows the progression of the research in this area. This team built upon a number of earlier research projects dealing with construction productivity, preventing premature construction starts, and the impacts of out-of-sequence construction. Too many projects start construction simply because the schedule says it's time to mobilize, without taking the time to make sure that there's enough engineering and materials available to stay ahead of the construction crews working in the proper sequence. So if you can't feed the crews, this is going to lead to out-of-sequence work, quality problems, poor morale, delay claims, all kinds of undesirable outcomes that are summarized on the next slide. The research team quantified the difference in performance between projects that started when ready versus projects that started too early, and these are the results. Personally, I like to turn these data around and say that, because starting construction too early is preventable, rather than saving money by starting when you're ready, you're actually wasting money if you start before you're ready. So if we ignore good practice and start too early anyway, these are the expected risks. 25% more cost, 40% more worse productivity, 7% more rework, 26% more change, and 28% longer schedule. Now, I don't care how big of a hurry we think we're in, I'm not sure anybody would logically take on that kind of risk. If you're being pressured to start construction too early, share these results with the decision maker applying the pressure. I think in most cases, the longer duration alone negates the entire premise of starting early because we're in a hurry. The next slide shows the CRA process. The construction team answers 228 questions, and these are yes/no questions, in the workshop and assigns corrective actions for those items that need them. As those issues are addressed, the project aligns with best practices to start construction when ready and prevent the kind of performance problems we discussed on the previous slide. The next slide shows how the questions are organized. So they're grouped into 15 categories that affect a project's readiness to start construction. I'll give you a few seconds to look at this. Okay, the output of the tool is shown on the next slide. And here's the output gauge showing the overall readiness score. Of course, this is just the overall indication. The real value of the process is in the details behind the score, and those details are also part of the output report. This tool is designed to be used beginning in the definition or feed phase of front-end development as a checklist of what needs to be addressed to get ready to start construction. The overall score becomes more meaningful as you move through detailed design and engineering and get ready to actually start construction. So if you're in feed and you get a score of 37 or something like that, it's not the end of the world because you're not ready to start construction yet, time-wise. And so you can use that as a checklist of what you need to work on to get ready. So let's talk about practical implementation. I've only used this tool once. It's a relatively new tool. Excuse me a second. The team found that the real value was in the discussion and the differing points of view around answering the various factors. So Noé, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. So let's talk about the last one that we have here to share with you guys. It is a personal McDonnell assessment because of what we're seeing in the market. Frankly, our clients have been very interested in this kind of help, which is very much focused on assessing the readiness of their organization to embark in large capital project portfolios or major projects. And so again, this is more on the organizational side, but also, on the systems and procedures that are needed, because some owners have that very mature, but a lot of them don't, or they have governance in place that was 20 years ago when they used it, when they built projects back then, but they're not up to date. And so because it's not their business, this is very useful for them to get ready to embark in new projects. This is an interview-based process, again, for owners to evaluate their readiness to manage capital projects. And it does two things: identifies the areas of deficiency as well as areas of excellence. And these are basically recommendations that we provide based on our real-world experience as engineers and constructors, as well as best practices from those like CII, AACE, which is the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering, and the Project Management Institute. We combine those, we keep updating our questions for those interviews, and at the end, what we provide is a report outlining the areas that need to be addressed with an implementation or roadmap. So it's very specific, and that's for the owner to do by themselves, or perhaps they ask for additional help. The areas that are assessed are the following. And excuse me, as you can see, it is very comprehensive. It addresses all areas in a typical capital program or project, mainly at the portfolio level. So the owner makes sure they have the right systems in place and procedures, or if they need to bring it from outside, that's also something they need to evaluate. And it can be also scaled or changed to include other areas that are needed depending on the types of projects that are to be executed. The typical deliverable is something like this, where you see the different areas that I mentioned, the 16 or so, with very specific, not only scoring, but also findings based on what your own people as an owner are telling us. This is critical. It basically becomes like a report that is the voice of your own people, that very often they are very aware of what the issues are, but they're not getting that attention. They're not getting what they're asking for based on the needs they see. So this report helps to formalize based on experience, and frankly, a third party that also validates or confirms what the needs are. And so very specific findings, as you can see here, as well as recommendations. What is the best practice, not only from our perspective, but also from best practices like those of like CII. So, okay, with that, let's do one more poll. If you can help us here, Mike, please. Let's see what our audience says.
Okay, here's the second poll. Again, you might have to go full screen to use it. Which assessments would be beneficial for your projects? And this is a select all that apply kind of thing. Results pouring in. Thank you for that. We'll wait a few more seconds. Got about 70% response. Okay, here are the answers. So PDRI, 85% of the respondents. Integrated project risk assessment, 72%. Project health check, 73%. Construction readiness assessment, 76%. And the Burns and McDonnell portfolio program readiness assessment, 43%. So thank you for those results. That's really interesting. And it's encouraging for us.
I agree.
Having done this webinar. Yeah. So let's go ahead and go to questions. We're happy to take your questions. You can put them in the question tab that Jenny talked about. We've got quite a few already.
Mm-hmm.
So are the IPRA and pH and project health indicator tools not industry specific? This question is from Ashanafi. And no, they're not, because the IPRA for the most part talks about risks outside the project. There are some risks inside the projects, things like labor and local jurisdictional rules about getting things out of customs and those kind of things. And then the project health indicator talks about team issues. So those are not industry specific. John Palmer says, is there guidance for addressing highly volatile project areas that directly impact projects like tariffs and labor availability? Thanks, John. It's good to hear from you. Yes, so those are in the IPRA. Those are 2 of the 82 categories that you look at. There's not necessarily guidance for addressing them. The IPRA is more of a identification and assessment tool, and then the project team would come up with its own mitigations on how to handle those. Jorge says, I've tried to use this type of assessment during project initiation. My findings are that people are reluctant to evaluate the project team at initiation, and also that it is a waste of time. Sometimes initiation is a little too early. Sometimes you have to have a little bit of run time to assess the team. So I would not disagree with what you're saying here. Noé, do you have any feelings on this one?
I tend to agree with that. It just depends on, if it's too early, you may not have much to assess, but something that I got from the comment was that they're assessing the team. And in my experience, you have to be careful with the messaging when you are selling the idea, if you will, of doing this, say a PDRI, that is during the front end. You want to do it early, and you want to make sure they know that you're assessing the scope, not the team, but the scope. And I say that, not that I'm saying you did it wrong, but in my experience, there's confusion sometimes. People think you're assessing the team and their performance. So you want to be clear on that, so they see they're not pushing back, and they see, oh, okay, this is going to help us assess our deliverables and what information we're missing, things like that. That would also, I would recommend looking into that as well.
Yeah, the earliest I've used the PDRI is when we've gotten the 30% submittal from the designer, the conceptual design kind of thing. I've used the PDRI, and you don't use the whole thing. At that point, you're using the business, the first section and part of the second section, the business case for the project and some of the fundamental design elements. Later on, as you get more design, you wind up using the whole thing.
Hey, Mike, one other thing that I like to mention about that is, and it applies to, I think, all assessments, is that oftentimes if it's being facilitated by somebody internally, it can be a little more challenging for people to see it as a requirement or as formal, as valuable. And so having a third party, I mean, yes, this is the consultant speaking. I understand. Don't think that I'm just telling, but I've seen that people perceive it in a different way. And if it's required by the project sponsor, or expected at least, people pay more attention. They participate more seriously. And the way you facilitate is important. It's got to be explained the right way so people know how to prepare. So I wouldn't discount those considerations to make sure that the team is well aware of what to expect and how to participate, so they see it as valuable as well.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions here about the construction readiness assessment. So I'm trying to pull that up because one of them got specific. But let's see, Chris and Ashanafi ask, is there a minimum construction cost that the CRA tool is geared toward? And I would say not really. I think you would look at the investment, which is probably the core project team, especially your construction team and engineering team, and figure maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to run it, and that's your investment. So how small of a construction project can afford that kind of investment? Where is that investment reasonable, in other words? That's how I would look at it. Another thing that I wanted to mention is, the PDRI is a scope checklist. The IPRA is a risk checklist. The construction readiness tool is a checklist. Many companies have their own checklist for these things as well. And so what I recommend is, if your company does not have a checklist for that, then use the CII tool as it is. If your company does have a checklist like that, then look at your checklist and look at the CII tool and see if there are things in the CII tool that you should add to your company's tool, right? And then you may not use the tool or the Excel spreadsheet that CII has. You might use your own company checklist, but I would check it against the CII tools, because these things were all based on research that's been validated with statistics and other things. And so, I'm making this up, but the IPRA, they might have started with 200 risk elements, but in that research process, they would have done some assessments and some statistics and so forth, and kind of boiled it down to the most important 82. Okay, so that's how I recommend people use the tools. Noé, do you have anything to say on that?
No, I agree with you. It's got to make sense to the company, and to me, in general, not just the CRA, but 1 hour of an assessment, well planned, well facilitated, it's well worth the investment. Just the conversation, the checkpoint, and to me is worth it. But to the question, it's got to make sense also financially and time wise. So your threshold of, hey, 1 hour doesn't make sense, I think it's the right one, the right way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think especially on the construction readiness tool, look at those, the damage if you start before you're ready, and consider that also. You know, what do you stand to prevent in terms of cost overrun and schedule overrun by using this tool? And that's another way to look at it. Okay, Godson asks, are the CII tools similar to the IPA or independent project analysis tools? I'm familiar with IPA, which we use for major capital projects. There is some similarity on some of the tools, but not all of them. So they were developed completely separate from IPA. I'm pretty familiar with IPA. So these were developed completely separate. I think the big advantage of the CII tools is that they're relatively low impact. You know, of the ones that we talked about today, the PDRI is the most costly to run, so to speak. And that's, you know, your core project team for 4 hours. When you compare that to IPA's questionnaires, you know, those often take, you know, hours, I'll say, much more than 4 hours. You know, some people work on those for a couple of weeks before the assessment. So it's a much more in-depth and much more expensive assessment. But IPA certainly does some good work as well. Daniel says, could you elaborate on factors related to the project management within the, you know, you said PRA assessment. I assume you're saying the construction readiness assessment, and I'm going to try to look that up. Ashanafi, can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes. There'll be a recording and the slides will go out, and Jenny mentioned that. Melissa says, how can we learn more about performing these assessments internally? The way to do that is to download the tool. If your company is a CII member, you can download it from the website. And if your company is not a member, you can buy it through, I believe, TextSource. But Jenny, maybe you can get some information.
It used to be called TechStreet. It's now called Accuris, ACCURIS. Non-members can purchase tools on that platform. If you Google ACCURIS and CII, it should take you to the right page.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. How is the best way to implement PDRI and other practices? I always come at these things from a solve the pain approach. In other words, where is the client having the most pain? And then select the CII practice or tool that addresses that pain. So for instance, if you're constantly overrunning your schedule and cost estimates, it might be because your schedule and cost estimates aren't very good to begin with. And if you're having a bunch of change orders and field changes and stuff like that, where you say, you know, like I've said a number of times, who's the idiot that designed this? Now, not knocking the designers. I said that about myself actually on one project that I designed, okay? Because there was a pretty blatant thing in there that I missed. But, you know, if you're asking yourself those kind of questions, or, you know, who are the people that planned this thing? The PDRI is a great tool for that, because it's going to help you identify, you know, how mature your scope is. And basically, if your scope is mature enough to support a cost and schedule estimate that's realistic, right? That you have a realistic method of, or realistic chance of hitting. Noé, do you have other things on that?
Yeah, I'd like to add, I like your approach of implementing PDRI or starting to use it as part of the cost estimating and scheduling exercise. That's how, in my experience, that's always better received. If you use it as part of your cost estimating process and make it just like that part of the process, that way you're always you know, asking, okay, let's do an estimate review. Have we done a PDRI? And if not, then we're not ready to do the estimate review. And if you also if you convince the project sponsor or the executive in charge of the business or the project or portfolio. That frankly has been my most successful approach, by presenting something like this to them and say, hey, you got to be aware of the PDRI, here are the benefits. And most of them go, why are we not doing this? Well, that's frankly the best way to go about it. Instead of trying to convince a project manager, it's very difficult because they're busy, they may perceive it differently. So go to the project sponsor or executive and present the value, but also make it part of the process. So it's not like, well, we don't feel like doing it this time. Those two things have been very successful in my experience.
Yeah, and another thing that you want to do is you want to start small. Try it on one project, like a pilot approach to implementing one of these tools. And oftentimes, if a project is in trouble and there are team issues, the project health indicator can be a great one. But try it with one project, get the results, talk to the project team about the results and what they're learning and that kind of thing, and then publicize the heck out of it. If you have a good case study inside the project or inside the company, then publicize it and say, hey, this project used this tool and these are the results. I just recently did that on that PDRI that I told you about on the power line. We wrote that up for our internal newsletter, and I'm trying to get small projects to adopt the PDRI as well. And so that's the best way to do that. Mark Alderfirst says, we use some of these tools yet would benefit from using the others. Thank you for the webinar. You're welcome. Project health indicator seems very subjective. How do we take the subjective analysis out of the equation? This is Courtney Stewart. Great question. The project health indicator does seem to be a little more subjective than some of the other tools, but you try to, some of it helps by having a neutral facilitator. If there are problems, like with PHI specifically, if there are problems with the project team, if the facilitator knows some of those problems, that helps them kind of push back a little bit on some of the answers that might be a little bit too optimistic. But there's a little bit of subjectivity, probably in all of these, but we do try to make them as objective as possible. For instance, on the PDRI, you rate every deliverable on a 1 to 5 scale based on its maturity. Well, there's a definition for what a 1 means and what a 3 means and so forth. So we're trying to make it as objective as possible, but sometimes that's more challenging than others. Noé, do you have anything on that, on subjectivity?
I think you nailed it, Mike. Again, to me, the biggest benefit, because I agree with the person who asked the question, I believe it was Courtney. I agree it's subjective, but the benefit of the conversation with a preset list of very specific questions that address all of the key areas of a project, that is highly beneficial. And that's where I would focus the most, more than the score itself. And that, frankly, for team morale, if the team sees that you as the project leader or the project sponsor are making the time, even over lunchtime. And again, this should not be facilitated by the project manager. It needs to be somebody else. And sometimes, I'll be honest, in some cases, we have had to ask the PM not to be part of some of the sessions, PDRIs or others, because they want to be answering the questions themselves instead of the lead of a certain discipline. And so you want to manage those dynamics, and it's not easy. That is why having a third-party facilitator, and if you don't have that person in-house, it's worth the investment to go outside and look for someone to do it at least the first time. That way, that first time, going back to your point, Mike, that pilot or first test use of a tool, it's done, by somebody who's done it before. And that way you're not reinventing the wheel, and that first time then being a success story, you can share it later. But good question, and I would focus more on the benefits of the interactions.
Yeah, TG Jayanth, how you doing? It's good to hear from you. Says, how does IPRA work with quantitative risk management? Are both needed or just one or the other? I would say both, TG, because the IPRA gives you more of a qualitative result. Quantitative risk management, you're normally assigning specific percentages and dollar amounts to schedule activities and then running a Monte Carlo simulation or something like that. So I would say the IPRA is more on the qualitative side to use early, and then later in the process when you have more detail in your schedule and so forth, you probably want to use quantitative risk management certainly on a large project. Let's see, a lot of these, let's see. Joseph Cotter says, a lot of the items that these tools flag as common sense and an experienced PM can usually identify them. The challenge is typically how they handle them. Is there any initiative to take these tools from identifying to best practices, how to address these challenges? That's a great question, Joseph. And I think the short answer is no, because how we handle these things is so dependent on the specifics of the project. I'm not sure if there are some, rules of thumb and that kind of thing that would be helpful, but I think that's looking for more of a silver bullet. Question for Noé from Ivor Cremens. How you doing, Ivor? It's good to see you. What types of projects are considered in the program portfolio of projects? A mix of grassroots and revamps and smaller projects? What about a mix of total installed costs? 50 million and $1 billion plus?
Oh, that's a good question. I appreciate that. I mean, for our portfolio readiness or program readiness assessment, most of the ones we have conducted are for portfolios of well over $400 to $500 million, and they are, or it could be, that's in the case of portfolios. In some cases, we have mega projects, well worth more than $1 billion, and so it's a big range, frankly, and they can be a mix, and typically they are. It's grassroots, is brownfield, is facilities, is interconnection lines. For example, in the last program was for a renewable natural gas portfolio where they had the RNG facilities alongside with the interconnects, both electrical and gas. So we were able to it was a very successful assessment, which allowed the client to implement what they needed to scale, which, as you can imagine, they were not used to building so many projects at the same time. So with that assessment, it gave them the roadmap to set up their PMO the right way to manage all of which is a mix of projects once again. And that portfolio was well more than $1 billion US.
Thanks, Noé. Okay, I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you very much for your attention. And that's all we have time-wise for today, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of Construction Safety Week. Everybody be safe. We do appreciate you joining us today. Until the next time, take care.